"Can I hug you, sir?" the maid's toddler asked. The billionaire broke down in tears. The house was too quiet at 11 p.m. It was always too quiet. Nathaniel Cole sat behind his desk, papers stacked in neat towers, a cold cup of coffee forgotten by his elbow. Outside his window, the estate stretched out in darkness, gardens no one walked in anymore, a pool no one swam in, a nursery down the hall that had stayed locked for 2 years. He didn't hear the study door open. He didn't hear small feet cross the carpet. He only looked up when he felt something small and warm standing beside his chair. A little girl. Maybe 3 years old. Dark curls falling into her eyes. A stuffed rabbit hanging from one hand. She should not have been there. The staff knew better than to let anyone near his study at night, let alone a child he had never seen before in his life. "Where is your mother?" he asked, his voice sharper than he meant it to be. The girl didn't flinch. She just tilted her head, studying him the way children study things they don't yet know to be afraid of. "You look sad," she said. Nathaniel opened his mouth to send her away. To call for whoever had lost track of her. To go back to being the man this house had taught him to be, closed, untouchable, alone. Instead, he said nothing at all. The girl stepped closer. She set her rabbit down on his desk, right on top of a contract worth $11 million, and looked up at him with the kind of patience only small children have. "Can I hug you, sir?" 4 words. Nathaniel Cole, a man who had not cried at his own wife's funeral, who had shaken hands with senators and buried grief so deep his own staff didn't know it existed anymore, felt something crack open in his chest. He didn't answer her question. He didn't have to. His arms moved before his mind caught up, and he pulled the stranger's daughter against him and broke down in a way he hadn't let himself break down in 2 long years. Somewhere down the hall, a woman's voice called out, frantic. "Lily! Lily, where are you?" The footsteps stopped in the doorway. And the woman standing there, seeing her daughter wrapped in Nathaniel Cole's arms, went as pale as if she'd seen a ghost. Because in a way, she had. 3 days earlier. Clara Reyes stood on the front steps of the Cole estate with a suitcase in one hand and Lily's small fingers wrapped around the other, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. The house was bigger than anything she'd ever worked in. Stone lions guarded the entrance. Windows stretched 2 stories high. Somewhere behind those walls lived a man whose name she hadn't said out loud in 6 years, not because she'd forgotten it, but because she couldn't afford to remember what it used to mean to her. Mrs. Reyes. A woman in a grey cardigan opened the door before Clara could knock. Sharp eyes, silver hair pulled back tight, a face that had clearly seen every kind of person come through this house and judged most of them quickly. "I'm Margaret. Head of staff. You're a bit of a rush hire. The agency said you could start today." "Yes. Thank you for taking us on short notice." Clara kept her voice steady. She'd practiced that steadiness in the mirror that morning. Margaret's gaze dropped to Lily, then to the suitcase, then back to Clara's face, lingering there a beat too long, the way people look at something they almost recognize. "You'll have the small room off the east wing. Meals in the kitchen, not the dining room. Mr. Cole doesn't involve himself with domestic matters, and I'd suggest you keep it that way. He doesn't like surprises." "Understood." "And the little one?" Margaret glanced at Lily again. "Is there someone to watch her during your shifts?" Clara's chest tightened. "I was told there'd be a staff nursery." "There was. Before." Margaret's mouth pressed into a thin line, and she didn't finish the sentence. "We'll sort something out. For now, keep her close, and keep her quiet. Mr. Cole works from home most nights. He doesn't like to be disturbed." Clara nodded, and didn't ask what before meant. She had a feeling she already knew. The first 2 days passed carefully. Clara learned the rhythms of the house the way she'd learned every house before it. Quickly, quietly, making herself useful and invisible in equal measure. She dusted rooms that hadn't been touched in what looked like years. She polished silver no one used. She kept Lily tucked into corners with coloring books and her one stuffed rabbit, and she prayed her daughter's small voice wouldn't carry down the long marble halls. She caught glimpses of Nathaniel Cole from a distance, a tall, broad-shouldered man who moved through his own house like a stranger in it, eyes fixed somewhere far away even when he was looking right at you. The staff spoke about him in hushed, careful sentences. Before the accident, he used to laugh. He hasn't been up to the 3rd floor in 2 years. Don't mention his wife. Ever. Clara didn't need to be told twice. She already knew more about Eleanor Cole than anyone in this house suspected. On the second evening, as Clara tucked a blanket around Lily in the small East Wing room, her daughter reached up and touched the thin gold chain around Clara's neck. "Pretty," Lily said, tracing the small oval locket hanging from it. "It was your Aunt Ellie's," Clara said softly, before she could stop herself. "I don't have an aunt." Clara kissed her forehead and tucked the locket beneath her collar, out of sight. "Go to sleep, baby." She didn't sleep much herself that night. It was Margaret who noticed first, the way Clara's hand stilled over a photo frame in the hallway, the way her breath caught for half a second too long. It was an old photo, half hidden behind newer ones on a side table. Eleanor Cole, maybe 20 years old, laughing with her arm around a much younger woman who looked remarkably, unmistakably like Clara. Margaret said nothing. But she remembered. On the 3rd afternoon, disaster arrived in the smallest possible way. Clara had been called to help prepare the dining room for a visitor arriving that evening, and in the 10 minutes she was gone, Lily wandered. She wandered the way 3-year-olds wander, following a sunbeam across the floor, then a strange painting, then the sound of her own humming, a lullaby she'd heard her mother sing 100 times without ever knowing where it came from. She didn't know it was Eleanor Cole's lullaby. She only knew it was pretty. Margaret heard it from 2 rooms away and nearly dropped the tray she was carrying. By the time she caught up to the sound, Lily was standing in front of a door at the end of the 3rd floor hallway. A door that had been locked, untouched, for 2 years. The nursery door. It was open. Just a crack. Golden late afternoon light spilling out into the dim hall. "Sweetheart," Margaret said carefully, kneeling down, "you shouldn't be up here." Lily looked up at her with wide, unbothered eyes. The door was already open. Margaret's blood went cold. That door was never open. She herself had checked the lock only that morning, the way she checked it every morning, an old habit she couldn't break. Somewhere behind her, heavy footsteps stopped. Nathaniel Cole stood at the top of the stairs, staring at the child standing in front of his daughter's nursery. The room he hadn't been able to bring himself to enter since the funeral, its door standing open for the first time in 2 years. His eyes moved from the door, to the little girl, to Margaret's stricken face. "Whose child is this?" he said quietly, "and why is she standing in front of a door that doesn't open?" Neither of them had an answer for him. Nathaniel didn't get an answer that afternoon. Margaret ushered Lily away with careful, practiced hands, murmuring something about cookies in the kitchen, and Clara appeared moments later, breathless and pale, apologizing in a voice that shook more than the situation seemed to call for. "She's usually not out of my sight," Clara said. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Cole. It won't happen again." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment, really looked, the way he hadn't looked at anyone in this house in longer than he could remember. Something about her face nagged at him, familiar in a way he couldn't place, like a song heard once in childhood. "See that it doesn't," he said, and walked away before she could see how shaken he was. But he didn't forget it. Not the open door. Not the child's easy, unbothered voice. Not the strange, hollow feeling in his chest when he'd heard that lullaby drifting down the hall, a lullaby Eleanor used to hum while she was pregnant, one he hadn't heard in 2 years and had never taught to anyone. That night, for the first time since the funeral, Nathaniel Cole found himself watching his own staff. He told himself it was simple curiosity. A man protecting his home from questions he didn't have answers to. It didn't feel simple. He noticed the way Clara Reyes carried herself. Quiet, careful, like someone used to making herself smaller than she was. He noticed she never quite met his eyes, the way most people didn't, except her seemed to be avoiding something specific, not just his position or his money. He noticed, one evening, a slim gold chain slipping loose from her collar as she leaned to gather dishes. A small oval locket, old-fashioned, the kind you didn't buy from a store anymore. She tucked it away quickly when she caught him looking, her cheeks coloring. He said nothing. But he remembered where he'd seen that exact locket before. In a photograph, in a drawer, in a life he'd tried to seal away. The visitor arrived the next evening, and the entire house seemed to hold its breath differently around him. Richard Voss swept in wearing a tailored coat and an easy smile, the kind of charm that had opened boardroom doors for 30 years. He was Eleanor's cousin, and since her death, he'd served as executor of her family trust. A responsibility Nathaniel had been too grief-stricken to question closely and had simply let him keep. "Just a routine visit," Richard said, clapping Nathaniel on the shoulder like they were old friends instead of two men bound together by a woman neither of them had saved. "Trust paperwork. Quarterly reviews. Won't take long." But something shifted in Richard's easy expression when he passed Clara in the hallway, carrying a tray toward the kitchen. He stopped mid-sentence. His eyes followed her, sharp and calculating, the charm draining away for just a moment before he caught himself and smoothed it back into place. "New staff?" he asked Nathaniel, too casually. "Recently, yes." Richard's jaw tightened. "You should be more careful who you let into this house, Nathaniel. Not everyone is who they claim to be." Nathaniel frowned. "Do you know her?" Richard's smile came back, practiced and smooth. No, of course not. Just old habits. A man in my position learns to be cautious." But later that evening, from the study window, Nathaniel watched Richard corner Clara alone by the garden hedges. Too close, his voice too low for words to carry, but his body language unmistakable. Clara's arms were crossed tight over her chest, her chin lifted in the stubborn way of someone refusing to be intimidated even as she trembled. Nathaniel couldn't hear what was said. But he saw Richard grip her arm as she turned to leave, saw Clara yank free of it, saw the flash of fear cross her face before she composed herself and walked briskly back toward the house. He didn't go down. He told himself it wasn't his business. He was already lying to himself, and some part of him knew it. Clara found Lily asleep in their small room that night, the stuffed rabbit clutched under one arm, and sank down onto the edge of the bed with her hand shaking. "Leave now, before this goes too far," Richard had said. "You know what happens if you stay. You know what I can do." She'd known coming here was a risk. She hadn't expected him to still be circling this family like a vulture 2 years later, still controlling everything Eleanor had left behind. She touched the locket at her throat, the one thing of her sister's she'd been allowed to keep, and thought, not for the first time, that she should pack their bags tonight and disappear before anyone else recognized her face. But then she thought of Lily standing in front of that nursery door, humming a lullaby she'd never been taught, and some small, stubborn part of Clara refused to run. "Not yet," she told herself. "Not until I understand why that door was open." Nathaniel couldn't sleep. He found himself, past midnight, standing in the storage room at the far end of the West Wing, a room he hadn't opened since he'd packed away everything of Eleanor's he couldn't bear to look at every day. Boxes stacked to the ceiling, labeled in his own handwriting from 2 years ago, written by a man who'd still believed grief could be organized and contained. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, only that something about Clara Reyes's face had lodged itself under his skin, and he needed to know why. He found the box marked Eleanor, family, before and opened it with hands that weren't quite steady. Photographs. Dozens of them. Eleanor as a teenager, a young woman, a bride. And there, near the bottom, creased from age, a photo of Eleanor at perhaps 20 years old, slung around the shoulders of a younger girl with the same dark eyes, the same stubborn set of the jaw. Nathaniel stared at it for a long time. The younger girl in the photograph was, unmistakably, Clara Reyes. Behind him, footsteps. Margaret's voice, quiet and heavy with 2 years of a secret she'd never been asked to share. "You found it, then?" Nathaniel turned, the photograph trembling slightly in his hand. "Who is she, Margaret? Who is Clara Reyes to my wife? Margaret's eyes were wet. That, she said softly, is a conversation you need to have with her yourself. Not with me. Tell me. I promised Eleanor I never would. Margaret's voice cracked. Some promises outlive the people who ask for them, Mr. Cole. But I think it's time you finally asked the right question. Nathaniel looked down at the photograph again. At Eleanor's laughing face, at the young woman beside her. He now realized he'd been watching clean his house for 3 days without any idea who she truly was. Get her, he said quietly. Now. Clara stood in the doorway of the study, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to keep them from shaking. Margaret had woken her gently, apologetically, and said only, he knows. Or close enough. He wants to see you. Now Nathaniel stood by the window with his back to her, the old photograph resting on his desk in a small circle of lamplight. He didn't turn around right away. I found this tonight, he said finally. In a box I haven't opened in 2 years. Clara's eyes fell to the photograph, and something in her chest folded in on itself. Eleanor, 20 years old, laughing. Herself, 17, still believing her life would always look like that. I can explain, she said quietly. Then explain. He turned to face her now, and his eyes weren't angry, exactly. Just exhausted, and full of a hope he seemed almost afraid to let himself feel. Who are you to my wife? Clara took a breath that seemed to reach all the way down to her feet. Eleanor was my sister, she said. My half-sister. Same father, different mothers. We didn't grow up together. I only found her when I was 16, and she was 23, and neither of us cared about the mess of how it happened. We just wanted a sister. Her voice wavered. We had 6 good years before the accident took her from both of us. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Why didn't you ever come to the funeral? Why didn't I know you existed? I wanted to. I wrote to you, actually, right after. You never got the letter. Richard intercepted it. He told me, very clearly, that showing up would only complicate the estate, complicate the grief, complicate everything. That it would be selfish of me to insert myself into your pain when we barely knew each other as a family. Clara's hands twisted together. I believed him. I was young and grieving, and I let him convince me I didn't have a right to be here. And Lily. Something in Clara's face softened entirely at her daughter's name. Lily is Eleanor's niece. Yours, too, in every way that matters, even if it's not blood. She met his eyes fully for the first time. She's never known any of this. I never told her whose house we were coming to. I just needed the work, and this was the only opening the agency had, and God help me, some stubborn part of me wanted to see this place one more time before I let it go for good. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Clara's heart nearly gave out from the waiting. Then Nathaniel Cole, cold, guarded, untouchable Nathaniel Cole, sat down heavily in his chair and put his face in his hands. 2 years, he said, muffled. 2 years I thought I had nothing left of her. And there's been a piece of her living in my house for 3 days, and I didn't even know to look for it. What followed felt, for a while, like something out of a dream Clara hadn't let herself have. Nathaniel insisted they move out of the small East Wing room and into proper guest quarters. He insisted Lily stop calling him sir, though the little girl, delighted by the strange, tall man who let her win at cards, took a full week to manage Mr. Nathaniel instead. Dinners, which had been silent, solitary things for 2 years, became loud with Lily's chatter and the clatter of her fork against the good china she absolutely should not have been allowed to use. Nathaniel found himself smiling, really smiling, the muscles unfamiliar and a little sore, for the first time since the accident. He taught Lily to build card towers on the study floor while he worked. He let her leave crayon drawings taped to his office door. One evening, he found himself sitting on the nursery floor with Clara beside him, finally opening boxes of Eleanor's things not with grief but something closer to gratitude, laughing at old photographs, crying a little too, but the good kind of crying. She would have loved this, Clara said softly. watching Lily nap curled up on Eleanor's old rocking chair. She would have loved you being happy again. Nathaniel didn't trust himself to answer. He just nodded, throat tight, and let himself believe, for the first time in 2 years, that maybe the worst part of his life was finally behind him. He was wrong. Richard Voss returned 8 days later, and this time there was no easy charm in his expression at all. He arrived unannounced, a leather folder tucked under one arm, and found Nathaniel and Clara in the garden, Lily chasing a butterfly between the hedges while both adults watched her with the soft, unguarded expressions of people who'd let themselves hope. "Isn't this touching?" Richard said, and something cold slid beneath the words. "A regular little family." Nathaniel straightened. "Richard, I didn't realize you were coming. I came because I heard you'd learned some interesting family history." Richard's eyes cut to Clara, sharp as a blade. "I told you to leave quietly. I gave you the chance to disappear before this got complicated. You didn't listen." "Richard, whatever business you have with Clara can wait," Nathaniel said, an edge entering his voice. "She's family." "Is she?" Richard opened the folder and produced a document, holding it out not to Nathaniel but to Clara, his hand steady, his voice colder than Nathaniel had ever heard it. "Then perhaps you should explain to your new family that the guardianship papers you carry for that child are built on a document I drew up myself, 6 years ago, when you needed somewhere for a baby to legally belong to someone who wasn't a scared teenager with no support and no money." Clara went white. "Richard." "I falsified a birth record to protect you," Richard said, "when your own family wanted nothing to do with an unmarried teenage mother. I did you a favor. And I can just as easily walk into a courtroom and undo it, and have that little girl removed from your custody within the week, unless you take her and disappear the way I told you to in the first place." The garden went utterly silent except for Lily's distant, delighted laughter as she chased her butterfly, oblivious to the ground shifting beneath her entire world. Nathaniel stared between them, something cracking open in his chest that had nothing to do with grief this time. "What is he talking about, Clara?" Clara's eyes filled with tears, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's true. Not the part he's twisting. I am Lily's mother, that's never been a lie. But the paperwork, the legal guardianship, his right. It isn't clean. It never has been." "You have 2 choices," Richard said, folding the document closed with terrible calm. "Vanish quietly, the way you should have 6 years ago, and I make sure no one ever looks closely at that paperwork again. Or stay, and fight me, and risk a judge deciding your daughter belongs somewhere else entirely while lawyers pick apart every choice you made as a scared 18-year-old with nowhere else to turn." He looked at Nathaniel, almost pitying. "And you, Nathaniel, are you really prepared to drag your late wife's name through a custody scandal in the press, 2 years after burying her? Because that's what happens the moment this becomes public." He turned and walked back toward the house, leaving silence behind him thick enough to choke on. Clara sank onto the garden bench, her whole body trembling. "He's not bluffing. He's never bluffed in his life. If I fight this, Lily could actually be taken from me while it's all sorted out in court. If I run, we keep her, but we lose," her voice broke. "We lose this. We lose you. We lose the only real family either of us has left." Nathaniel knelt in front of her, taking her shaking hands in his. Across the garden, Lily's laughter rang out again, bright and untouched by any of this. "Clara," he said quietly, "look at me. Whatever this costs, whatever it takes, I am not letting that man tear this family apart a second time." But even as he said it, he didn't yet know the full truth of what fighting Richard Voss would actually require, or what it would cost all of them before this was over. Clara looked at him, torn between the fear of losing everything and the terrifying hope that, for once, she wasn't facing this alone. "What do we do?" she whispered. Neither of them had an answer yet. Clara didn't run. It took her 3 sleepless nights to reach that decision, sitting awake beside Lily's bed, watching her daughter breathe in the peaceful, unaware way only children could manage while the adults around them quietly fell apart. But by the fourth morning, she found Nathaniel in his study before sunrise and said the words that would change everything. "I'm not disappearing again. Not this time. Whatever it costs." Nathaniel looked up from a desk covered in old files. He'd clearly been awake all night reading. "Good," he said. "Because I think Richard's been lying to both of us for a lot longer than 6 years." The investigation began quietly, the way real investigations do, not with dramatic confrontations, but with tired eyes and long nights and boxes of paperwork nobody had looked at closely in far too long. Nathaniel called in Eleanor's family trust records, something he'd left entirely in Richard's hands since the funeral, too grief-stricken at the time to question a man who'd seemed so willing to shoulder the burden. Margaret helped, pulling old correspondence from storage, her mouth tightening with every folder that confirmed what she'd apparently suspected for years but never had proof enough to voice. "I always thought it was strange," Margaret admitted one evening, spreading old bank statements across the kitchen table, "how quickly Mr. Voss took control after Mrs. Cole passed. How reluctant he was to let anyone else near the accounts." Clara stared at columns of numbers that meant little to her at first glance. "What are we even looking for?" "Anything that doesn't add up," Nathaniel said grimly. It didn't take long to find it. Eleanor's family trust, inherited from her own parents, meant to eventually pass to any children she had been steadily drained for years under Richard's management. Small withdrawals disguised as management fees. Investments that quietly underperformed while nearly identical amounts moved into accounts bearing Richard's name. Nothing so large it would trigger alarm on its own. Everything large enough, over time, to matter enormously. "He's been stealing from her," Clara whispered, staring at a spreadsheet Nathaniel had built late into the night. "From Eleanor. 4 years. Not just stealing." Nathaniel's jaw was tight as stone. "Look at the dates. The falsified guardianship document Richard used against you. It's dated the same month he made his largest unexplained withdrawal. I don't think that was a favor to a scared teenager, Clara. I think removing you from this family, cleanly and permanently, was exactly what let him keep control of everything without anyone from Eleanor's side of the family asking questions." Clara sat back, stunned. "He needed me gone. Not to protect me. To protect himself." "And it worked," Nathaniel said quietly, "for 6 years. The final piece came from Margaret, 3 days later, in the form of an envelope she'd kept locked in her own quarters since Eleanor's death, a letter Eleanor had written and asked her to hold, just in case, never explaining further, never expecting it would matter this much. Nathaniel's hands shook as he opened it. "If you're reading this, something has happened to me, and Richard has likely taken control of things he shouldn't. I've never fully trusted him with the trust, only never found the courage to fight him on it while I was healthy and it felt easier to look away. There is a provision in my will, filed separately from the main estate documents, naming my sister Clara, and any children she may have, as rightful beneficiaries of my family trust, equal to any child Nathaniel and I might have together. Richard knows about this provision. He has always known. If it has been buried or ignored, it was not by accident. Please, whoever finds this, make sure my sister is not forgotten twice." Nathaniel set the letter down, his eyes wet, his hands trembling with something between grief and fury. "She knew," he said hoarsely. "She knew what he might do, even then." Clara pressed her palm against her mouth, tears sliding freely down her face. "She never forgot me," she whispered. "Even after everything, she never forgot me." But knowing the truth and proving it to a room full of lawyers were two very different battles. Nathaniel understood, with growing dread, exactly what exposing Richard would cost him personally. The trust's mismanagement would become public. His late wife's estate, and by extension her death, would be dragged through headlines all over again, 2 years after he'd finally stopped seeing her name in every newspaper. His own company's board, already uneasy about his long absence from public life, would use any scandal as ammunition. "There's still time to walk away from this," he told Clara late one night, though his voice made clear he didn't want her to take that option. "I could quietly force Richard out, settle everything privately, Keep all of this out of the press. It would protect the company. It would protect Eleanor's memory from becoming a headline again. And Lily? Clara asked quietly. And the guardianship document he's threatening to expose? Nathaniel's jaw tightened. It would still be hanging over you. He'd still have that leverage forever, quiet settlement or not. Then we don't do it quietly, Clara said, with more steel in her voice than Nathaniel had heard from her yet. I'm done disappearing so other people's secrets stay comfortable, Nathaniel. Eleanor wrote that letter so I wouldn't be forgotten twice. I won't let her down by hiding a third time. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment, at the woman who had walked into his house 3 weeks ago as a stranger and become, somehow, impossibly, the reason his home finally had light in it again. Then we do this together, he said. All the way through. Richard moved faster than either of them expected. Word must have reached him, perhaps from someone still loyal to him among the trust's outside accountants, that Nathaniel had been quietly pulling records. 2 days after Clara's decision, Richard's lawyer filed an emergency motion in family court, seeking immediate custody review of Lily Reyes based on the very guardianship irregularities Richard himself had created 6 years earlier. The hearing was set for the following week. He's trying to strike first, Nathaniel said grimly, reading the notice Margaret had rushed into his study. Get a judge to rule before we can present the trust evidence publicly. If he wins custody review before Eleanor's letter and the financial records become part of the record, he controls the narrative completely. Clara's face had gone pale, one hand pressed protectively to her chest as though she could physically hold her daughter closer from across the house. Can he actually win? Nathaniel didn't answer right away, and that silence terrified her more than anything he could have said. Not if we get to the trust board first, he said finally. There's an emergency board meeting scheduled for 3 days from now. Eleanor's family trust requires it, if there's evidence of executor misconduct. If we can present everything there, the letter, the financial records, all of it, before Richard's custody hearing, we don't just discredit his claim against you. We destroy the foundation his entire case is built on. 3 days, Clara whispered. 3 days, Nathaniel confirmed, to save your daughter, clear Eleanor's name, and take down a man who spent 6 years building his lies on top of my wife's grave. Outside the study window, evening was falling fast over the estate, and somewhere down the hall, Lily's small voice rose in laughter, utterly unaware that in 3 days, the fight for her entire future would begin. The trust board met in a conference room on the 40th floor of Coal Industries, all glass and cold morning light, and Clara had never in her life felt smaller walking into a room. 9 board members sat around the long table. Richard Voss sat at the head of it, in the executor's chair he'd occupied for 2 years, wearing the same easy smile he'd worn the day he walked into Nathaniel's garden and tried to destroy everything Clara had left. Nathaniel, Richard said warmly, as though this were any routine meeting. And Ms. Reyes. I wasn't aware you'd be joining us. You knew exactly what this meeting was for, Richard, Nathaniel said, setting a folder on the table with a quiet finality that made 2 board members exchange glances. You called it yourself, 3 days ago, hoping to review my competency to manage Eleanor's affairs going forward. I thought it only fair we discuss yours instead. The easy smile flickered, just slightly. Nathaniel began with the letter. He read it aloud, his voice steady even as it caught on the parts where Eleanor's words became almost unbearably tender. Make sure my sister is not forgotten twice. Around the table, expressions shifted from polite boredom into something far more alert. One older board member, a silver-haired woman who'd known Eleanor since childhood, pressed a hand to her mouth. This is a private family matter, Richard interjected, his voice tightening. A grieving widow's letter, taken wildly out of context. It's dated and notarized, Nathaniel said calmly, sliding a copy down the table. Filed with Eleanor's attorney 6 weeks before her death. It names a beneficiary this board has never once acknowledged in 2 years of trust distributions. He looked directly at Richard. I wonder why that is. What followed was methodical, and worse for Richard than any shouting match could have been. Nathaniel laid out the financial records one by one, the small withdrawals disguised as management fees, the investments that quietly underperformed while identical sums appeared elsewhere, the falsified guardianship document dated the same month as Richard's largest unexplained transfer. Clara, her hands finally steady, spoke for herself for the first time, describing the frightened 18-year-old she'd been, the favor Richard had offered her, the warning he'd given her only weeks ago in a garden, to disappear quietly or lose her daughter entirely. "You had 6 years to correct this," Nathaniel said, closing the folder. "Instead you spent them hoping neither of us would ever compare notes." Richard's composure finally cracked. "I built this trust's returns for a decade," he snapped. "I kept this family's finances stable through Eleanor's death, through Nathaniel's total absence from any of it. Everything I did because no one else was willing to." "You did it," Clara said quietly, "because it was easier to erase me than to explain me. Because a scared teenage sister was inconvenient, and stealing from her was invisible as long as I stayed gone." The silver-haired board member spoke up, her voice sharp with 60 years of quiet authority. "Mr. Voss, is the guardianship document authentic, or is it not?" Richard said nothing. That silence answered every question the board still had. He was removed as executor before lunch. The board voted unanimously to freeze his access to the trust pending a full independent audit, and to refer the falsified guardianship document to the appropriate legal authorities. Richard's lawyer would spend the following months negotiating restitution rather than defending a case with no defense left. It wasn't a dramatic downfall, no handcuffs, no shouting, no scene from a movie. Just a quiet, thorough unraveling of a lie that had lasted 6 years, ending the only way lies like that ever really end, in daylight, with nowhere left to hide. Clara had expected to feel triumphant. Instead, watching Richard gather his things in silence, all she felt was tired, and sad, and strangely light. "You could still press further charges," Nathaniel said quietly as they rode the elevator down. "Fraud. Forgery. You have every right." Clara shook her head slowly. "I don't want revenge, Nathaniel. I just wanted Lily safe, and Eleanor's memory to mean something true again. He's already lost everything that mattered to him. That's enough." It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. But it was something close to peace, and after 6 years of running, Clara found she didn't need anything more than that. The custody threat dissolved within the week. With the falsified document now part of an official record, created under Richard's misconduct, not Clara's, the family court process that followed was almost gentle by comparison. Paperwork corrected, guardianship properly and permanently established, no judge left with any real question about where Lily belonged or who her mother was. Clara cried reading the final court order, not from fear this time, but from the sheer relief of an ending that didn't require her to disappear. That evening, the house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than the one Clara had first walked into 3 weeks earlier. Not empty. Settled. She found Nathaniel in the nursery, of all places, sitting on the floor beside Lily, who was very seriously teaching him how to properly dress her stuffed rabbit in a scrap of blanket. "He needs a scarf," Lily informed him. "It's cold outside." "Understood," Nathaniel said, with the same grave seriousness he'd once used in board meetings, and Clara had to lean against the doorway for a moment, overwhelmed by how far this man had traveled from the stranger who'd stood frozen in his study 3 weeks ago. Lily looked up and spotted her mother. "Mama, Mr. Nathaniel is bad at scarves." "I'm learning," Nathaniel said solemnly, and Lily giggled, and Clara laughed too, wet-eyed and unable to help it. Later, after Lily had fallen asleep clutching her newly scarved rabbit, Nathaniel and Clara sat together on the nursery floor in the soft lamplight, surrounded by 2 years of boxes finally, fully unpacked. "I need to tell you something," Nathaniel said quietly. "About that first night. Why I broke the way I did, when she asked to hug me." Clara waited, watching his face carefully. "Eleanor was 7 months pregnant with our daughter when the accident happened," he said, And his voice, though steady, carried a weight Clara had never heard him speak with before. We lost them both the same night. I never got to hold my daughter. Not once. Not even to say goodbye. He looked toward the crib in the corner, the one that had sat empty and untouched for 2 years. I sealed this room shut because I couldn't stand walking past it and remembering that I never got the chance. Clara's eyes filled with tears. And then this little girl I'd never met walked into my study, Nathaniel continued, and looked up at me and asked if she could hug me. Like it was the simplest thing in the world. Like I hadn't spent 2 years convincing myself I didn't deserve comfort, that grief was something you were supposed to carry alone. His voice broke, just slightly. I wasn't crying for a stranger's child, Clara. I think some part of me was finally grieving the daughter I never got to hold, because Lily gave me permission to feel it, without even knowing that's what she was doing. Clara reached over and took his hand, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. Some things didn't need more words than that. Eleanor would have loved her, Clara whispered finally. And I think, somewhere, she'd be glad it was Lily who finally got you to let go. Nathaniel nodded, unable to speak, and pulled Clara gently into the kind of embrace that wasn't about grief anymore. It was about everything that came after it. The estate looked different in springtime, Clara thought, watching from the garden bench as Lily, now 4, chased butterflies across grass that had once seemed too quiet to hold any life at all. The nursery door stood open these days, always, sunlight pouring freely into a room that had once been sealed shut by grief. It wasn't Grace's room anymore, not really. Nathaniel had turned it, gently, lovingly, into a proper playroom for Lily, keeping only a small photograph of Eleanor on the windowsill, smiling down at whatever games unfolded beneath it. Margaret still ran the household with the same sharp efficiency, though these days her stern expression softened considerably whenever Lily came barreling through the kitchen demanding cookies. The trust, under new and carefully vetted management, had been fully restored, a portion of it now settled permanently in Lily's name, exactly as Eleanor had always intended. Richard Voss's name came up rarely anymore. When it did, it was mentioned only briefly, without anger, the way you might mention old weather from a storm long past. Nathaniel crossed the lawn now, 2 cups of tea in hand, and settled onto the bench beside Clara, watching Lily attempt, with great determination, to catch a butterfly that had absolutely no intention of being caught. She asked me this morning, he said, smiling, whether butterflies get scared of being hugged too. Clara laughed, leaning her head against his shoulder. What did you tell her? I told her, Nathaniel said, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let something small and gentle get close enough to hold you. Even when you're scared. Especially then. Clara looked up at him, at the man who'd once moved through his own house like a ghost, now sitting in the sunlight with tea going cold in his hands because he was too busy watching a 4-year-old chase butterflies to care. You've come a long way, Nathaniel Cole, she said softly. So have you, he answered. Both of you. You brought this house back to life. Across the lawn, Lily gave up on the butterfly and ran instead toward the bench, arms already outstretched the way they always were now, unafraid, unguarded, certain of her welcome. Can I hug you? She asked, breathless and laughing, though these days it was never really a question anymore. It was simply how their family said hello. Nathaniel set down his tea and opened his arms without a moment's hesitation. Always, he said. Always, sweetheart. And somewhere, in the quiet, golden light of a spring afternoon, a house that had once held nothing but silence and sealed doors finally, fully, belonged to the sound of a family that had chosen each other, not out of tragedy, but out of love that had simply refused to stay buried. If this story touched you, if it made you think of someone you love, or reminded you that it's never too late to let someone in, tell us in the comments. Sometimes the smallest voice asking the simplest question is exactly what it takes to bring a broken heart back to life.